Hey guys, welcome back to Dragon Age. Today we'll take a look at an Affliction build for the Rogue class. This one applies the max number of stacks for both Necrotic and Bleed, ensuring a high damage over time effect. It also provides huge amounts of momentum generation via the Adrenaline mechanic, and using some of the duelist skills, you can become completely immune to all damage while using one of your strongest abilities. Plus, endless party synergies via prolonged combos and permafreezes makes it one of the most fun builds to play around with. Now, the way this build works is that we're going to apply the max number of stacks for both Necrotic and Bleed damage over time. So that's going to be 10 stacks in total for each of them, ensuring that you deal thousands of damage per second, even if enemies zone you out. So even if you can't hit in any other attacks once they get to defend, you're still going to see them die off because the damage is just too overwhelming. Plus, it's also very easy to maintain those number of stacks with just one more attack. Basically, every single one of your hits will apply or refresh the number of stacks really quickly. This also gets to power up some of your other mechanics, such as the stagger via abilities like the Mighty Strikes. Plus, it's also a very spammy build. You can easily generate momentum because we use the Duelist subclass and the Adrenaline mechanic to constantly generate momentum, which in turn also helps with defenses, not just ability spam. So let's jump over straight to the items. As you can see, we're quite reliant on uniques. However, a lot of them actually drop in quite early. So one of them is going to be Cordova's Toothpick. This weapon applies guaranteed bleeding on every single hit. Plus, it increases your max number of bleed stacks by another 6. So that's how you can reach the 10 max number between this and your own build. However, its physical damage is much lower than most other weapons, but I found out that your bleeding damage over time still more than makes up for that slight loss in physical damage. Besides that, you also get this relatively early. By level 10, you just hit Treviso and get it from one of the treasure chests over there. I already covered that in a previous video. The other weapon we're going to use is Arane's Talon. This is going to give us that permanent necrotic weapon. At the start of the combat, whenever we just unsheath the weapon, it's going to immediately have necrotic weapon activated. On top of the fact that you also gain a bonus necrotic damage boost from it, which looks really awesome, very useful. But by the way, you get this from the third boss in the Heart of Corruption questline. So again, there's going to be a video you can check out that I covered previously. The next one is Reptile's Recurve. While not needed, it's extremely helpful because this short bow applies necrosis on every single hit, and yes, this also applies it even if enemies block with their shields. Plus, it increases your max necrosis stacks by another 6, however, all at the cost of reducing necrosis damage by 50%. However, if you apply all the 10 stacks, you're pretty much going to be ahead in terms of DPS by about 20 to 25% just eyeballing it, so you're still going to have that high damage over time effect on it. You get this, by the way, a bit later around chapter 9 when you go to Dogtown and are able to complete all of the candle hops over there. So once you get all the 6 or 7 there are, you can pretty much get this as a reward from the chest back at the Shadow Dragon's hideout. Now, in terms of armor, we have quite a few options like the Striking Misfortune for the chest piece, which boosts the necrotic damage, necrotic resistance, even cleanses afflictions if we use necrotic abilities, and also gain immovable at legendary quality if we get hit by necrotic damage. Or if you want something more direct, you can use Recruit's Simple Tunic. This is going to give you more damage versus armored enemies, even boost your heavy damage attacks, and if you break enemies' armor at legendary quality, you can even do this AoE damage explosion to enemies nearby. Alternatively, you can get the Plumage of the Mad Crow. This is going to make your perfect dodges to unleash projectiles around you that deal physical damage and also apply necrosis. However, for this, you need to have saved Treviso because you can only buy it at the Antivan Crow vendor, and you also need to max out your reputation with them and level that up to rank 4. In terms of helmet choices, we actually have quite a few more. So Antivan Parade can help early on. You get this from Treviso and it increases your necrotic weapon damage and duration, helps a bit more with the stacks application at legendary quality, and even doubles the damage against enemies suffering from necrosis to make up for some of that loss in damage from one of the necrotic weapons. Another one could be the KhrazeGaming double hat if you want more momentum generation and ability spam. This can also work and you can make it legendary a bit sooner. And there's also a couple more, but probably you'll eventually want to aim for the Death Mask. This just increases all your affliction damage and duration, so this works for both necrosis and the bleed stacks. It's even going to help you deal an extra AoE damage depending on the number of stacks of 3 unique afflictions you have on the target. So you have to have these 2 and the third one. So that third affliction could be the bees. Yes, I'm not even kidding. There's bees damage over time here provided by Jenny's belt. Also comes in early from Treviso, but when you use potions, you apply that damage to all nearby targets. So all in all, within these 3, you can pretty much apply all of these afflictions to so many targets around you and just let them die off rather quickly on top of the bonuses that you get. And speaking of that, in terms of jewelry, there are some important here. So for the ring, the Precious Decay is one of the best. You get this plus all of its duplicates to legendary quality from Necropolis. So this increases your necrotic damage even more and even contributes to your necrotic damage over time by other damage bonuses you might have in your build. So again, even more ways to make up for that loss in necrosis damage. And finally, one for the bleed, the bleeding shard. I can't really remember where I got this, but it helps us a ton more with the bleeding stacks, and it just like increases that duration by even more. And maybe eventually you want to get it to legendary quality to have an 11th bleeding stack to help you with it. Now, skill tree wise, here is what we're working with. You can just go ahead and copy this down. The first ability I'm going with is going to be Riposte. This helps a ton against enemy spam attacks. You follow up with a very strong attack that applies those stacks very easily, and it also helps to stagger them a lot better, especially against bosses that do that. But our first active one is going to be the Pilfer. This helps a ton to heal ourselves up. The cooldown is not too bad, and it also detonates Overwhelmed, so it synergizes very well with the warriors we'll have in our party. Now, from this point on, we'll take this line to the left side as it's going to increase our bleeding and necrotic weapon stacks or application. So spill blood for an extra stack of bleeding. Also going with the blood poisoning, which is going to make perfect defenses. And then we're going to also buff it with some of these 2 right here, including the Desolate, Mallory, which increases affliction damage, and Poison Reply. Poison Reply is what's going to generate necrotic weapon for you early on when you don't have that secondary weapon. And it also increases necrotic weapon damage by 25%. And then we'll take just a couple of these down the line options like the Death Blessing and eventually also Necrotic Fog. We spend a lot of momentum in the end game, so every 150 of that will apply even more necrosis to targets nearby. This is going to help a ton with the Noxious Presence as well, as Pilfer is a control ability, which means it's going to also generate more toxic gas around us. So overall, this is going to be a very, very toxic, AIDS-inducing build because of all of these sources of necrotic. Our second active ability is going to be the Toxic Dash. This is going to help us to maintain those stacks of affliction even more early on. It's also good damage, and because it's a primer that applies Sundered, it synergizes very well with a mage in your party. But it's also a strike ability, so we can buff it with strike-related passives, such as the Mighty Strikes, which is going to boost its stagger potential by 100% if we hit enemies afflicted by, well, affliction. So in this case, bleed and necrosis, which are active all the freaking time. Now, from here, we're going to aim for the Duelist subclass as soon as we hit level 20. On the way there, we also get Adrenaline, which makes our successive strikes against targets to give us an Adrenaline buff, which increases our damage. At the cost, of course, if we get disrupted by enemies, it resets the whole thing. However, once we hit level 40, we'll make it much stronger with these passives in the Duelist line. So Mounting Thrill is going to let us stack 3 charges of Adrenaline for 3 times the amount of damage bonus. Then we're going to reduce the number of attacks needed for 1 stack by 2 via Adrenaline Rush. And then we have these 2 right here, especially Deflection will only make us lose 1 Adrenaline charge at a time when we take damage. Plus, it's also going to boost our damage reduction by 40%, so that's going to help us a ton to just maintain our HP. And finally, Energy Burst also helps quite a bit. You gain a nice health and also momentum boost by 10% for those adrenaline charges, which again helps a ton with survivability and ability spams. On the way there, we're going to use 1,000 Cuts, another strike ability that synergizes very well with this Affliction build, deals very solid damage, and at the same time, you can also become completely invulnerable to all damage during it, specifically with this Enchanting level 9 option right here that makes you gain invulnerable on use. It's one of the few abilities that have that. So if you are about to get damaged or just want to tank something or are about to die, you can just pop one of these off, and it only costs 1 momentum charge, and because we generate so much of that, you're going to just spam this very often. Plus, its final pierce attack can also throw enemies off ledges if you don't want to deal with them for too long. Eventually, you'll also want to focus on the momentum, so using dynamic gains for 50 momentum. This also works with the earlier determination, which gives you another 50, which I recommend to also get early on. And then you can also get the balanced flow. You deal 30% more weapon damage and also take 25% less damage relative to your current momentum. So literally, as you generate more of that and keep it, you're going to perform even better. I don't recommend Covenant Energy because you're just going to consume that, deal more damage. But if you still want to and want to see higher damage numbers, it's totally still an option. It depends on your playstyle and if you want to consume that on something else than abilities or not. From this point on, there are only a few abilities here that really matter. Slice Strike is one of them, so you can heal yourself and gain a bit of ultimate when you perform takedowns, which you can do quite often with this. Additionally, I would also go for Momentous Occasion. Again, helps a ton more with momentum generation, but most of the other things from this point on are just there to boost your damage. They are not 100% mandatory, so get them as you level up and eventually you should have the proper build going. Now, in terms of the companions we use, I recommend going with another mage and another warrior in your party so that you can just detonate all the time, pretty much having 2 detonations back to back because of the synergies you can create between each class to the next one. So yeah, rogue detonates warrior, warrior detonates mage, and mage detonates warrior. Basically just ensures that you do this all the time. And in this case, I really enjoy going with Knave and Davrin, but you can also use Stash and Velara or any combination of this. However, Knave is just so strong because of her frost attacks. So Icebreaker helps a ton to detonate the Sundered effect that we apply with our Toxic Dash, and at the end of her quest chain you can get her Investigator's Robes as one of the options, which is going to just freeze enemies in place if you detonate with her. And that's going to help a ton because you already reduce her resistances with the basic scepter that she comes with anyway, so that pretty much triggers all the time. Besides this, I also enjoy using her Blizzard. In the off time, you can just spam and yeah, just freeze enemies in place with this so easily on top of her detonations. And besides this, she has Glacial Pace, which applies Weakened, and this can be detonated by Davrin. And Davrin actually has a very strong legendary from one of his end quest decisions called the Wildwood Benefactor, which makes detonations against staggered enemies to deal more stagger to all enemies nearby, on top of a bonus damage that you get against them anyway. So that can help quite a ton with the death from above, which will detonate Weakened. But since he's a warrior, he also applies Overwhelm with Heroic Strike. So if you go back at yourself, you can just use the Pilfer to detonate that. And like I said, we're going to have an endless chain of this constantly happening all the time, which helps a ton. Now, the only other thing I have not covered is our ultimate for our own class, and that's going to be the Concussive Barrage. Now, I really enjoy this compared to anything else, even compared to the Murder of Crows, just because of the high physical and stagger damage that it deals. For some reason, this just feels much stronger than any other option that I got, but you can also go with the other one if you want more AoE and kinda hit all targets at the same time. But anyway, this is pretty much it with the video. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.